Okay, so welcome everyone to the Association for Rational Thought monthly meeting. Today we have Brian Crosby talking about Cleveland Abbey. I won't go into detail about the talk itself. I'll let him just give it. So Brian has had a business career directing sales, customer service, and organizational effectiveness in 3 separate industries: chemical, telecommunications, and grocery. He recently retired from Kroger's Business Analytics Process Optimization Group. He holds a BS in biology and a Six Sigma MBB certification, past member of Xavier University's Williams School of Business Executive Advisory Board. He's currently a volunteer at the Cincinnati Observatory. His very acute retirement hobbies include grandchildren, travel, photography, and sailing. Brian and Sue live in Montgomery, Ohio, with 4 children out of the nest. So I will turn it over to Brian and let him talk about Cleveland Abbey.
Great, Sue. Well, thank you very much. And thank you also, Gary, for setting this up and hosting it. I don't know a lot of you, but certainly I've read up a little bit on your group, and it sounds like a very interesting group. And I'm just very honored to talk with you and looking forward to, dialogue, your questions, and certainly learning about this great man. I think it's very propitious that we're talking about this. Oh, I see another sailor. Oh, very good. Propitious that we're talking about it today. We're in the middle, or at least we went through a weather event, and I was looking at the weather forecast as it was coming in, and 3 days out, it said it would come in and hit at 5 o'clock, and precisely at right around 5 o'clock, it started to snow. And it just is another example of how far we've come in weather forecasting. And I found out through this project, and hopefully I'll share with you today, that it really all started in the US and really in worldwide, as far as the data-driven aspects of it, started right here in Cincinnati 153 years ago. So I really want to give this group a generalized overview of this great man. Today's talk will be in 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about his legacy, just to give, set the context. And then I'm going to touch on the high points of his life and career, just to give some perspective. Then I'm going to focus on what he did here in Cincinnati, and then the museum's collection, and then just open it up to general discussions. And I understand from Sue that you have you generally tend to ask questions as the presentation goes on. That's fine. I anticipate this taking about half an hour of just going through the information, and then we can start discussion after that. So with that, let me share my screen. Any questions as we first start? Okay. All right, I'm not too adroit at this. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, very good. So we're going to be talking about Cleveland Abbey, who is the observatory's second director. And generally, my style is to kind of throw up a slide. You're free to take a read on some of the bullet points. They're there basically for your background, and then I'll just kind of talk over that and apply a little perspective. So with that, first of all, his legacy. as far as Cincinnati goes, he revived the observatory. It had lain just really dormant for about 7 years. So he revived it back in 1868 when he was appointed, and he set the course. He didn't actually preside over it, but he set the course and made the city council and city fathers know that you needed to move it from Mount Adams to where it is right now, which is in Mount Lookout, the observatory area. He also made accurate time available to the cities and the merchants. Cincinnati was a growing commercial hub. And as we'll talk about a little bit further, a little bit later into the program, there was an absolute need for precise, accurate time. And so he was able to provide that. And his big claim to fame is that he was the first to compile these actual weather forecasts. Pretty much it had been summaries of data, and you could make your own conclusions, or perhaps an editor or a reporter might be able to say, and this means such and such. Well, no. What Abbey's genius was it was based on measured, standardized facts from very dispersed stations, which we'll talk about. He was also, I did not know this at all, he was a key leader in setting standardized time zones. And by the way, don't forget to reset your clocks this weekend. We'll get into that. And then truly his legacy, and I think what prompted this group to be interested in him is that he was a pioneer in American meteorology and really helped set the course. He was a genius. He lived in a very unique time, and with his skill set and his understanding of science and knitting together a lot of different pieces, he was able to make some real applications. So and contributions to American science. So anyway, that's an overview of his legacy. Now, kind of let's get into I'll give you a quick run through of his life's accomplishments. He was born in 1838. He was lived in New York. His father was a very wealthy merchant of dry goods, kind of a self-made man. His mother was very well educated, did not have a degree. I think at that time, women, there were very, very few women that had any kind of advanced degrees, but she kept up her contacts, both in the social world and the academic world. What was big at the time were academic lectures by visiting scientists and merchants that use science. And in fact, when Abbey was 8 years old, his mother came home and told him, and he remembers this, told him about a lecture that she had just attended from Mitchell, who was the founder of the Cincinnati Observatory. And what I thought was very interesting is, little did he know that by 30, he would be the second director, whereas Mitchell was the first. He would be the second director of the Cincinnati Observatory. He was a pretty precocious kid. He had severe nearsightedness. He got very interested in the natural world. He summered at his grandfather's farm in Connecticut. Very interested in nature. Optics, started off in microscopy, but then got into the actual grinding of lenses. And for a nearsighted kid, that was just it. He even said at one point, I would listen to people saying that, the stars were out there and were twinkling, he had no idea that I mean, he took their word for it because he couldn't see the stars until he started applying his lens making and dealt with a few mentors in that, and was keen at that point, was keenly interested in astronomy. His education and his academic growth. He graduated in 1857 from what is now City College of New York. At that point, once he got his degree, actually before, he tutored in mathematics. He was pretty gifted in mathematics and whatnot. But he was just looking around at things that interested him. And he finally committed to go to the University of Michigan to study astronomy under Franz Bruno, who had been director at the Berlin Observatory and was a worldwide figure in astronomy. So he wanted to study under him to further his education. He didn't pursue a graduate degree. They really weren't into graduate degrees at that point, but he was hooked when it came to astronomy. And with combining his mathematics and his astronomical background, and also the fact that his mentor, this Franz Bruno, had done a lot of measurements, star measurements that will allow points to be fixed. Abbe joined as a young man the Harvard University Coast Study, which was basically identifying specific layouts for lighthouses, things like that. When the Civil War rolled around, he was part of the group, very patriotic group. Again, he was in Massachusetts at that point. He enlisted in the Massachusetts Regulars, trained, went through boot camp, but then in 1862, he was rejected by the Union because of his nearsightedness. At that point, he stayed with the Coast Study, but then he went to Pulkovo Observatory because, and again, I think it was due to the influence of Bruno, he wanted to be exposed to astronomy and the European tradition, which was recognized as cutting edge in astronomy. He received a 2-year leave of absence from the Coast Study to do that. Here's a picture of Pulkovo. Pulkovo is right outside of St. Petersburg, which was the Tsarist capital of Russia. At that point, they had state-of-the-art equipment, 15-inch refractor, which was even larger than, was larger than anything that the US had. He was employed as what was called a supernumerary astronomer. And I was jazzed by that. I said, I don't know that term. What is supernumerary? Sounds great. Well, I did not know this, but I looked it up, and you certainly can. Supernumerary says you're not on the staff. You're the help. You're not paid. You're not compensated. You have no rank. So I thought it was just some great honor, but he was basically, if you will, directionless. He stayed there for 2 years to his credit, and he started to he even started up a romance, but just everything started to fall apart. His romance failed. He had very, very low compensation, nowhere to go. He wasn't a member of the staff. And this is kind of a thread at the University of Michigan, where he had just left. He really wasn't earning much money at all. So he was getting a lot of extra support from his father, again, this merchant. And and you'll see that again in a few other things. But at that point, he just said, look, I'm out of here. I'm going to go back to the US and get involved with the coast study.
So did he have to speak Russian?
Well, he spoke a little bit of German, but German was kind of the lingua franca of science at that point. So I didn't see a specific reference to that. I'm sure he was pretty conversant, but I don't know that he had to have a command of it, fluency. Good question, though. Of course, the Civil War is the worst years of the Civil War, plus the assassination of President Lincoln happened during this time. He came back and he was assigned by the Coast Study as an assistant in the Naval Almanac office. And so he was finally earning a meager salary, not much, but a meager salary. And he was transferred to Washington, D.C. His responsibilities, again, going to his mathematical background, were to use the meridian, circle, and transit telescopes and calculations to calculate time and to fix coordinates. And that was extremely important that you staff up in that area. This was during the Reconstruction time. This was during the westward expansion time. There was a lot going on in the U.S. at that point. But the most important thing, and I think one of the things that I'd like you to understand about Abby is that he was a supreme networker. And you see it for the first time here. He networked in Washington, D.C. I mean, it was a tremendously busy time. It was, again, during Reconstruction, but then also the Smithsonian was starting to get its legs under itself again, after the war. Now, to give you a little bit of context, the Smithsonian had, in the 1850s, taken notice of the fact that telegraph stations were being set up all over the United States, and they were coming up with an idea of getting standardized reports, nothing special, just temperature, weather conditions, wind speed, from these various locations. And they actually put it up on a map in the Smithsonian that they would update each day. Now, again, this was in the 1850s, but it was just really just they called them synopses. It was like synopsis. It's just a summary of what's going on. There was absolutely no intent of forecasting or anything like that. That would be after the Civil War. But so the Smithsonian had a background in all of this. Civil War happens, everything is disrupted. Well, finally, they're able to kind of, as I said, get their legs under them and start going through this. Well, he networked through all this. He met the Smithsonian people. He met Langley, at that time, a senior staffer, later director of the Smithsonian. And he started to exchange these ideas and was present there at that point. So he networked there. He met some of the top officials, going back to the Michigan days and to the Pulkovo days and whatnot. He networked, and this was in a time there was no telephone. It was all either personal interaction or yeah, I guess by telegraph, but primarily it was by handwritten note. So here's a scientist, but he's very, very aware of the interactions, and it's not what you know, it's who you know, that kind of thing. And with my background in sales, I certainly respect that. Here's a picture of him about that time, 27 years old, good looking, dapper guy. This is in This is in Washington, D.C. Okay, I'm going to move forward. Again, this is just an overview of his accomplishments. He took on the second directorship. He became the second director after Ormsby McKnight Mitchell had left the observatory in 1859. So here Abbey came in. He saw the kind of deplorable state of what was the instruments. I mean, you can imagine lying idle for about 9 years with all the heat history of going on, the humidity, as we'll see, the building wasn't in very good shape. He was just, he brought the observatory back to life, which is no small feat. He also developed very accurate, not just precise, but accurate, astronomically derived time to the city, and actually turned it into a monetized it, brought in about $1,000 a year into the observatory. And then his big claim to fame, the first newspaper publication of these probabilities using fact-based predictions, not gut feel, not umbrage, not anything, just fact-based predictions. And then he charted the course, as I mentioned. He didn't preside over it, but he really saved the observatory. Where it was in Mount Adams, it was no longer a functioning observatory.
So suppose you look at the stars. How do you determine the time from looking at the stars?
Well, by its geometry and trigonometry, looking at the angles and the actual time it crosses a fixed point. That is one of the claims to fame that astronomy has. You can actually come up with an exact, precise fix based on that. I'm not a mathematician, but I certainly know that that is one of the basic underpinnings of.
But how do you assign a number to the positions of the stars? So you wait. How do you determine when it's noon? Or
you can tell when the sun is directly overhead, so you know the exact length of the day. So you can make a number of divisions in the time of the day, so that you know what time locally it is. You know what time.
So noon is when the sun is at its maximum.
Yes, sir.
Yes, but that's
sidereal noon. I've gotten my.
But that is a problem. It can lead to a problem, because the sun appears to move. Obviously, the Earth is rotating, but the sun appears to move. And if you look at the entire 360 degrees around the globe, the sun moves, if you divide that by 24, in 15-degree increments per hour, right? So if you're in city A, which is on the eastern side of that time zone, or eastern side of that gradient, and then you're in city B, which is on the western side of that gradient, and then you say you're a city between there. Well, what is noon, and with a sundial, what is noon for city A is different for city B because of the difference. And if you have towns in between, they're all showing different times. But with astronomy, with stars viewed at night, that there's a return to that particular zenith each and every night for the stars. The stars are immovable. We're so far away, they are basically immovable. Or the precession is right.
I remember reading about Harrison, who developed the first usable marine chronometer, And he was doing the sorts of measurements you're discussing now. What's the, when is local noon compared to a meridian on which you standardize time? And if you can tell what time of day is a local noon, you know what longitude you are in. And this is the start of precision in human endeavor, because I remember he developed a clock that was accurate to within a few seconds over a time of a year, and no one knew how long a year was. So
Yes.
if you're trying to fix what time was, that was a little bit of an awkward. Brian, may I ask one question? Once the country begins communicating via telegraph, I can understand that, well, it's important to have standardized time because railroads need to know when arrivals and departures must take place and so on and so forth. But this gentleman, Abbey, made $1,000 a year supplying exact local time to businesses. Why was that so important? What business depends on a really accurate notion of what the local noon is?
The answer is really the timepieces of the period. Before, we all carry on our wrist pretty much, a quartz-based or some kind of a precise and accurate time period. But at the time, they were spring-loaded timepieces that people had, and they all were either fast or slow. And so if you were a merchant expecting a shipment to be in, and your timepiece was wildly slow or wildly fast, that could be a problem. So it was extremely important to recalibrate those devices from time to time. In fact, I found out after I'd done a lot of study on Abbey, that there was a business in Europe in the early 1800s whereby they would get precise time from observatories, and then enterprising people would then visit the observatory, wind their clock to that, and then make their rounds selling accurate time. And a woman in the 1890s and into the early 1900s in London actually supported herself, and she was a single mother, her daughter, by doing that, selling time.
We used to call up the telephone company and ask them what time it was.
Yes, that's right. They had a, I think it was tied at that point to an atomic clock. But I used to work for Cincinnati Bell Telephone, and I do remember coming across that in the archives. Interesting time. But again, that was those were his accomplishments. We're going to come back to this. I'm going to do a deep dive on this. So let's just move on. So then he moved on to the Signal Service, the U.S. Army Signal Service. And just to set the stage for that, the Signal Service was part of the U.S. Army, but it was very much involved with post-war reconstruction and then also expansion, not only of Army bases, but then also it was charged by the government to help protect the railroads, protect the settlers, oversee westward expansion, that type thing. And the Signal Corps was the area of the U.S. Army that basically employed people that not only would look at signals, but also telegraphy, all of that. So by February of 1870, President Ulysses Grant set up Public Resolution number 9, which supported the expansion of railroads, also responsible for weather observations, reporting, telegraphy, as we talked about. And the only group that could, that was a government function that could oversee it all was in the Army. And so it was assigned to the Secretary of War, Chief Signal Officer, and Abbey was hired in 1871 as their chief civilian scientist when he was on a leave of absence from Cincinnati. And we'll get into the leave of absence bit in a second. Well, from 1870 to 1891, the Signal Service, synopses, again, we talked, that's just a summary of observations, but then also they came up with probabilities driven by Abbey and his work. Map and symbols development all came during that time. What we know of today as fronts and the symbols that are used on the maps, they all developed during the time. There was a daily distribution to press associations from a centralized point, Washington, D.C., but it was telegraphed to the press associations. Nationwide expansion, but then new data points. We'll talk about the very limited data points that Abbey first started in Cincinnati, but they moved on to pressure gradients, relative humidity, all of that. And so it was a time of tremendous growth. The term changed from probabilities, which they got from Abbey. His first forecasts were called probabilities. Then the terminology changed into indications, and then by 1889 it became fixed as forecast. Study rooms. These were rooms where all of the data would come in, and the mathematicians and the meteorologists would then study all of this. And that was an Abbey invention, where you basically all got together, and it was like a server room, if you will. Educational growth. Abbey pioneered during his time the educational growth. At first, he took a very, very dim view of military men, military people dealing with these concepts. And so he set out to do something about it. And he set up some of the first educational and academic areas and meteorological programs. Time standards. Due to some of his initial work, he was identified both by President Grant, later by President Arthur, to be on a review commission, which culminated in the international, culminated not only in the time zone agreements, Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific, but also International Standards Conference by 1885, which he attended. This was when Greenwich was first identified as being the prime meridian, the international time zone, all the various things that we do today. By 1885, in just a 10-year span, they went from a review to international standards. In 1891, it left, all of this left the Signal Corps. By that point, the government had identified the Department of Agriculture as being a better place for it, took it away from the military, and later it was renamed the Weather Bureau. And of course, today it's known as the National Weather Service.
Question.
Yes.
So the international standardization, you said that he was a supreme networker. How influential was he individually, on the international stage of standardizing some of that stuff?
Good, really good question. I'm always reminded, good questions are those that you're prepared to answer. But I had wondered the same thing. Here was the thing. In Europe, railroads were quite extensive and whatnot, but Europe was a relatively small area and therefore didn't have to deal with a transcontinental time differences in time standardizations that the emerging United States had to deal with. We're all familiar with, the Transcontinental Railroad was first set in 1869. Well, it was absolutely essential that standardization happen. And so he became very prominent in setting time zones. Again, that commission from Grant. And then in 1883, they came up with the time zone agreement. And later in the presentation, we're going to actually see the map that they used to set this. Well, Europe very much liked that idea. And because of his connections with the European Astronomical Group, and to answer your question about networking, he achieved a certain degree of prominence. So he was viewed as a very prominent leader by the Europeans when they met to do this in London. And because of the fact that the British Navy and the British Empire was a worldwide empire, they basically said the prime meridian is going to be in London, in Greenwich. And so they set that. But to answer your question, he was viewed as a prominent developer of the whole concept. Okay, moving on. So what you see here is kind of his legacy from correspondence and publications and his academic credentials throughout his life. Pretty much during the later part of the Signal Corps and then the Department of Agriculture in the early 1900s, he like any good manager, he left the day-to-day and got into professorships, first assistant professorships and whatnot, Columbian in Washington, D.C., Johns Hopkins. He founded the Monthly Weather Review, which is still in publication. In fact, Craig just sent out a summary by a meteorologist with the National Weather Service on the Monthly Weather Review and the history of that. It's still in publication. He again promoted and supported advanced degree programs, and he was internationally recognized with various honorary degrees, medals, awards. He was at the Lord Kelvin Jubilee, the Golden Jubilee in 1898 as a distinguished guest. So he was a worldwide figure at that point. His family life, certainly can't ignore that. In 1870 in Cincinnati, he married Frances Neal, who is the daughter of a very one of the city fathers, if you will. They had 3 sons. They all went on to be very successful. One who wrote a book about his father and family life. I think it's called something in the Isobars, Cleveland Abbey and the Isobars. And Francis, though, died in 1908. He married Margaret Percival, his personal assistant, in 1909. Margaret died in 1936. She was very instrumental in promoting his legacy well into, well after his death in 1916. He was also very active in genealogical research, and he was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. He died in Chevy Chase, Maryland, in 1916 of melanoma. Okay, any questions before we take a deeper dive into Cincinnati and our collection? Okay.
I just
So-
had a quick comment on just real quick on time. If we, and a pun intended here, if we take a walk back in time, if you picture yourself in like the 1820s, travel was by horseback mostly, maybe by boat, but the powered steam engines were just coming in. So, information could only travel as fast as a horse or as a boat. And then we had the telegraph. And then we had railroads, which shrank space, right? We could move a lot quicker. Then we had the Transcontinental Railroad, which, just must have been mind-boggling to those people. And then you add in the telegraph, which gave you access to at the end of that line, wherever it went, you could get news almost instantaneously. This was really, the time zones, and this was really important for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think back to, my father and my mother, and gosh, my mother grew up in Oklahoma, and she even had an outhouse at her house back in her youth. And we always think of the progress that has been made, and it's truly amazing. And when you look at our kids, and they don't even understand, what a rotary telephone is. Well, think of it back then, the position that you were in. And again, getting back to Abby, his genius was applying all this stuff, understanding and reading and networking and connecting the dots. And then he finally moved away into meteorology from astronomy. Just fabulous. He's a guy that really needs to get known.
One other real quick comment: the maritime clock. That's a fascinating story. I know I'm not using the right term for clock, but but that's a fascinating story. The English government put someone in England, might have been the government, might have been a scientific organization. They announced a competition for a prize for someone that could come up. It was a large amount of money. And someone mentioned the name Hamilton. Maybe Hamilton was the person that won the prize. But you think about that. Okay, you're gonna design an accurate clock can operate on a ship that is getting water sprayed all over it, salt water, and you're gonna design that not only to be accurate but to keep the elements out. And without the clock, they really didn't know where they were.
The big thing for the ships is pendulums don't work. The ship's swaying back and forth. So you can't rely on a pendulum, which was the main way they were keeping accurate time at that point. That was the technology at that point.
And spring-loaded, the answer to get away from, the fact that pendulums won't work, that you had to come up with spring-loaded mechanisms. Well, you needed such a precise mechanism to be able to hold that time, because to your point, that was key. You could have a sextant, you could measure angular, distances and whatnot, and angles. You could do the math, but unless you knew what your time was versus a fixed point, which was the Greenwich Meridian, then none of your figures in your conversion books would work. So mechanics really had a big play in that.
It might be worth a presentation at a later date, but the gentleman who was more or less single-handedly responsible for the invention of the nautical chronometer is, as your colleague said, is James Harrison. He did it to win what was essentially the first government-funded research program, I think in the early 1700s. He is an engineer and actually an applied physicist of great standing. He invented something like 21 different things to make this chronometer work. And as you just mentioned, it did not work on the principle of pendulums, because he spent 20 years finding out in great detail why pendulums would not work. it's a fascinating story of its own right. And yes, it was very essential. It tied the globe together essentially almost as much as the telegraph did.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I agree. That'd be a great great discussion. I've got a book on that I read years ago that pretty much talks about all of that. So who knows? That's something I might be able to put together for you. But at any rate, so let's do that. Fascinating what he did here in Cincinnati. So if you remember, we left our hero back in Pulkovo. He was all dejected. He hadn't had, any real earning history. He had a failed romance. He failed to get on the staff in Russia. So as he's getting on a steamer back to New York, he came back home, if you will, to his father and his mother. He had a chance encounter on the steamer with a elderly widow who was confined to a wheelchair. And so they met up on the deck and they talked. Here's this young man, he's 29 years old, and this older woman, wheelchair bound, and they started to talk. Well, it turned out that, he said that he was an astronomer. He's returning to New York and whatnot. Turns out that she was the daughter of one of the founders of Cincinnati. It wasn't a Longworth, but it was part of the Emory. Her last name was Emory, which Emory Industries at the time was a fat renderer when Cincinnati was known as Porkopolis back in the 1830s and 1840s. Anyway, she was elderly, but she just took that fact back and mentioned it to a couple of her contacts. And again, through networking, one of the contacts in Cincinnati was William Hooper, who was secretary of, at that point, the Cincinnati Astronomical Society. Now, the Cincinnati Astronomical Society was just about falling apart at that point because their director had left in 1859. Ormsby McKnight Mitchell had left in 1859 to go to the East Coast to head up another observatory. He had abandoned all the equipment. He had basically just walked away from it all. So this Astronomical Society was on its last legs. And so William Hooper decided to correspond. He didn't pick up the phone. He obviously corresponded with Abby, who was in New York at the time. They arranged to meet at one of the downtown restaurants in New York. And Hooper said, hey, how would you like to come out and revitalize our observatory? At first, Abby was very, very reluctant to do that. His concerns, the equipment was long dormant. As I talked about, you can imagine this precise equipment sitting up, hot summers, cold winters, high humidity, low humidity, just gathering dust. It was just horrible. A very poor location. At that point, Cincinnati was coming alive. There was a lot of coal smoke. There was a lot of fat rendering. There was a lot of just all kinds of things going on in really the valley where Cincinnati was. And so the observatory was of no use. In fact, it had been delisted as a principal observatory in a worldwide almanac. And also, here's his bugaboo, unsure compensation. Hooper was not able to guarantee him any kind of, reliable compensation, but Abby just couldn't resist. And after a while of this correspondence back and forth, he did accept the second position in April of 1868. By June, after a couple of months of reconnoitering and looking over the equipment, he set the themes for the observatory. And so, I mean, it was a keen mix of, well, academic interest, but then also he could monetize a lot of the functions, such as measurement, the geodesy, the measurement of the earth, fixing coordinates, the wants of the citizen, he called it the wants of the citizen and surveyor, meteorology, because he kind of knew this from his work at the Smithsonian. He says, you know, I can maybe put something together here. So, and then also, yeah, astronomical at that point, astronomical observation. So, so that was those were the themes that he set. So the restoration, new location, he made the case of saying, look, I can revitalize the observatory. I can pull together all the books that have been lent out and whatnot. I can bring up the equipment, but your location stinks. It absolutely is not going to work. You've got to move west. You've got to get out of the valley that Cincinnati is sitting in. And at that point, Mount Lookout was identified in the Hyde Park area, and you know that was pretty far west at the time. And with the prevailing winds and whatnot, it would be getting clear air from the west, and you know it would be upwind, if you will, of the coal smoke. So again, this networking aspect of convincing the city fathers, who were very strapped at the time, because this was just a kind of a lark, this academic pursuit. He also advocated for repairs to the building, had a very outdated roof design. The entire roof moved out of the way. Well, you can imagine how much leakage and whatnot and on these instruments would happen. He cleaned and recalibrated. He performed initial astronomical sightings. He did sell some measurements, some surveying measurements to people that were expanding, restored the library, and again, this networking that's going on. Well, here's Cincinnati. This is in 1865, just a couple of years before the Roebling Bridge, which was finished in 1866. You can see they've just started to get along, get the cables along here. But you can see also the amount of warehouses that were right here on the banks. Well, obviously, this was a mercantile type of city, and there was quite a lot of interest in all things that would identify schedules and allow people to keep to schedules. So, focusing in on setting time, the city did not have this standard mean time. As we talked about, the accuracy from what was called transit meridian telescopes. He also bought a very, very fine pendulum clock from Europe. He supplied jewelry shops at an accurate time in 1868. I speculate, I've not yet found how he did that. Did he do it by the time-honored time ball method, which was, I think, to Times Square, New Year's Eve, when that ball drops? Well, that's what time balls are. That was a very time-honored way of identifying it over long distance. Or did he have people going out and making the rounds like this woman did in London? I've not yet been able to find out what that is. So it's an open question, and I'd love to further research that. And he set the course for selling this telegraphically transmitted time in late 1870. He had left by that time, but he had initially set the course for selling this and installing a telegraph in Mount Lookout, and before that, Mount Adams, and then sending it to the jewelry shops. So he had set the course, but that wasn't during his tenure. And here's some of the instruments that he used. There's a transit telescope, and you can see this rotating drum here, and it would identify when the star actually moved across. You can see a window here. Well, this window goes all the way up, and at the time went all the way across the room, and it would allow you to set up your telescope, and it would have a sighting mechanism that would transmit this information to this rotating drum, and you would have an actual blip when that time was met. At that point, the time was transferred to this Molyneux pendulum clock. And if you go out to the observatory today, you can find this clock and this room and these instruments, and you could actually, be there and see this. And which I just think is fascinating. And Craig is the facilities and collections manager there, and Craig has just done a fabulous job in keeping that together. Craig, any comments before I leave that?
Yeah,
Challenges?
I wanted to ask, so I've seen the clock. I know where that is. Is that room, is that in the newer building, the east side room? Or
Yeah,
is
the room in that photograph is what we call the West Wing. So it's in the newer, the 1873 Hannaford building. The instruments are no longer there. It's more of a classroom and a multi-purpose space
Right.
now. But
yeah, okay.
several of the instruments, the chronograph off to the left side, the portable telescope that's near that window, that is still around the observatory, at least in pieces. I think that's the one that the janitor dropped many, many years ago. The other instrument, the Meridian telescope, the transit telescope, has probably gone back to the Smithsonian or somewhere else. But there was a series of instruments that were in that room, and a lot of it is still up in the attic waiting to be put back together sometime.
Craig, can you describe the base here and how this is fixed? That to me is fascinating.
Yeah, because often, people think of observatory as having, the classic hemispherical dome to it. But as Brian kind of described, that window that's facing south is actually a slit that goes up over the ceiling and down the north wall. So the shutters would open up so you could see the night sky. And the telescope was fixed exactly on the north-south or the meridian line. And there were also usually portable telescopes that were used to properly align it, so it was dead on accurate. And the astronomers would actually wait for the Earth's rotation to bring the star or the object into their field of view, and then would make their observations from there, typically by hitting a telegraph key. So a signal from the clock would also, and the telescope would go to that chronograph, which operates much like a seismograph, same kind of recording paper mechanism. And then they could compare the time signal differences to compute the local time and the sidereal time. That instrument would be replaced later on with a much larger one where the astronomers actually rolled themselves underneath the instrument. It was on two piers that had an opening in the center, and they would roll themselves beneath it and make their observations that way. And very fittingly, that couch looked like it belonged at the psychiatrist's office, but it rolled back and forth.
So this process of identifying when the point in the sky reaches a certain place required a human observer to enter the information that went on the drum?
Yep, they would hit a telegraph key, and that would record the information. And then the data would have to be reduced from there. And one of the things they had to take into account was their personal equation, the time it would take someone to recognize that the star has hit the little guide wire that's inside the eyepiece they're looking through. How long did it take their brain to recognize that and their finger to hit the telegraph key? And that had to be computed into it. Also the delay and the mechanisms itself. Surprisingly accurate for the work they were doing, and extremely painstaking. But much of the work they were doing at the observatory was positional astronomy, so measuring the position of stars and planets, asteroids, meteors, and that information would be shared with other observatories around the world. So oftentimes people ask, what discoveries did you have at the observatory? And we didn't discover Pluto. We didn't discover the canals on Mars, but there are no canals on Mars, and Pluto is not a planet anymore. Our work continues on. So there. Before I take over Brian's total talk, I'm going to mute myself again.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Greg.
I don't want to get the discussion off track. So, but I do have a question. If it's not good now, we could do it later. My question is about the building on Lafayette Circle. And that's, which I believe that had a connection to the National Weather Service. Do you know anything about that, or?
Yeah, the building is.
And is this a good, I don't, if you want to answer that later, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think I can. Let me do that because I do have a picture. The Lafayette Circle does not exist anymore. It's all been part of the UC campus type thing, but there is a picture of what still does exist, and I'll get into that towards the end of the presentation if I can.
Great.
Okay, here is a picture of the new observatory. This did not exist in Abby's time. This was built in 1873, finished in 1873. This was shortly after the completion. So this is the culmination of Abby's assertion that it needs to be moved from Mount Adams or Mount Ida, it was as it was originally known, to Mount Lookout in Hyde Park. So if you notice here, and this is very recognizable. This is how it looks today, except this does not have the dome that is now there. This whole arrangement, this whole cupola, if you will, moved, but the dome was added much later. Craig, do you know exactly when the dome that you'll see today was completed?
Sometime between 1893, 1895 is the best we know.
And it replaced the cupola, it wasn't on top of it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was an entirely new structure.
Yeah, new structure, right. That rotated. Now, another thing about this picture is this is a time ball. And so here is the actual ball, and it would be raised up to the top here and hang suspended, and at a specific point in time, say on the hour, it would then drop. And so this was I don't know if this was the culmination of its drop or it's actually in the process of dropping below, but the point is it would start up here. When that precise moment was reached at 12 noon, say, it would start dropping. And so this originally was used for ships at sea, so that ship captains could actually see from a very, very far distance that, exactly what the time was. Now, this was in probably 74, 75, the date of this picture, again, shortly after completion. And so the time ball was actually built. Back in Abby's time, 1868, when he sold, I can imagine the concept was there, and perhaps it was there, but again, I found no reference. Anyway, so that's a picture of what a time ball is. Now, going back to the meteorological focus, and this is the fascinating point. John Gano, who was president of the city council at the time, was a merchant, a big deal, but he basically was the president and represented all the various merchants of the company. Abby got to him. Now realize this is a month after he said, I want to do all these things, and I want to restore the building, and I want to restore the instruments, and I want to do this and do that. He had the presence of mind to go to the big guy at that point, John Gano, and say to him, hey, I can put Cincinnati on the map for something that we really need, and we can be a national leader in this. And basically, these bullet points that I listed here are probably the bullet points, something like it, that he used in his discussions with Gano. And actually, there are existing letters where you can see in handwritten letters, look, here's my proposal. Widely distributed weather reporting stations, primarily to the west, but some in the south, because prevailing weather systems don't just come out of the west in Cincinnati, they come from the south. So we can get this. We can use trained observatories at each one of these stations using standardized calibrated instruments. The observations can be sent in to us at light speed via telegraph. We can compile it. Cleveland Abbey can compile it. We can develop predictions based on that. And then these probabilities can be published in local newspapers, posted at public sites. It's a done deal, right? So over the course of about a month or so, he convinced Gano, who convinced the city council that, hey, let's put some money on, let's give some money to this. And so the city council authorized a 3-month trial. And they said, okay, we're gonna fund this thing for 3 months, starting September 1st. And so we'll do that and be up and running by September 1st. Now realize this is July. Realize you've got no telephone. You've got nothing more than telegraphy and correspondence and word of mouth to be able to do this. And you've got to recruit, train, and ship instruments to field observers, develop a coding system to make sure that you have enough so it's not an extremely expensive proposition to send all this data out, and then forming a meteorological association to organize print reporting forms, and working with the publishing companies and whatnot, the newspapers and whatnot. You've got to do all that. Here it is. If you will, you make the sale in August, and by September 1st, you've got to be up and running. And Abby had said to Gano, I propose 11 sites to start with. So you've got to do all that in a month's time. I put together a lot of teams, and I put together a lot of initiatives. As a manager, a former manager, I'm just blown away that he was able to do this with the tools that he has. And oh, by the way, during this time period, get this, August 7th, in 1869, there's a solar eclipse. Abby wants to be part of that too. So they select, hey, where's the best viewing conditions? Here he is in Cincinnati. Probably it would be up in Eastern Dakota. They looked at, the swath that the eclipse would be taking and said, hey, let's go to Eastern Dakota. And this was all by, wagon train and by railroad. And it put together the instruments. So here are the various instruments that they used. And let's be part of the eclipse as well. So in the middle of all this back and forth, where you've got to set up and recruit and make sure you're getting things done, he goes off on this wagon train adventure into what was at that point Eastern Dakota. It was recently settled Indian territory, and he also participates in that. I'm just blown away by all that. Then on the way back, he decides to stop off in Chicago. There was a meeting of the association, AAAS, American Association of Science, a meeting there, he decided to go by the Chicago Board of Trade and say, hey, guys, here's something we're doing in Cincinnati. Do you want to also do something like that? And at that point, the Board of Trade, the very, instrument that could have, jumped onto this, said, the John Gano of that group said, when Abby made his presentation, he said, we have no time for this child's play. So it gives you an idea of the kind of town Cincinnati was, taking a risk, and Chicago said, no, we have no time for this. I just thought that was interesting.
I have a
So,
question.
yeah,
I may have missed it. So he took this job without pay at first, and then something was funded. But where did his salaries come from? How did he live?
no, he did have pay, but he was just concerned because there wasn't a source of ongoing funds, if you will. It's basically like he had a yearly contract
I see.
with no assurance of the funding for the next year,
I see.
because it was totally at the whim of the Cincinnati council and whatnot. So it's not as though he didn't have funds. He really didn't have a lot of funds. It wasn't paying a lot, but it was enough to get by on.
Okay.
So come the time, it's September 1st, 1869. His 11 stations, some of them didn't report at all. Some of them provided unusable data. Only 2 reports came in on September 1st. But he was undeterred. By September 2nd, he published it for the first time in the Cincinnati Commercial. The first forecast, at that point, it was just a summary, but the first forecast was printed in the Commercial, the newspaper of the time, on September 23rd. At that point, he had gone from 2 to 9 stations. By November of 1869, there was 20 stations reporting. Abby did all of the forecasts based on that. And then the trial ended at the end of December of 1869. Abby continued the forecast, continued to do it all by himself with no remuneration until it was transferred to Western Union. So Abby basically kept it going for the first few months of 1870 by himself and with his assistants. Again, it was just on a thread, but the commercial funding from the city council had run out. So that continued to just aggravate and annoy Abby, and it was kind of building that he was saying, boy, this is just not workable. I can't continue to work here. Anyway, here is the actual in longhand recording of the data that was sent in 1869. And I don't know if you can read it, but there's the station, the city, there's rain, there's rainfall, what the sky looked like, the temperature, what was called vapor, the barometer, upper clouds, lower clouds, and basically what he could have done with Excel spreadsheet, right? Because this is basically a spreadsheet, but this is what it first looked like before, just in terms of recording the data. Here is what it looked like. Okay, so this is what it looked like September 2nd. By September 8th, a year later, 1870, after Western Union had taken it over, this was what it was looking like. And these were actually transferred into the paper. And you can see the beginnings of symbols. This is, the arrows are showing the direction of the wind, the temperature, whether it's static or not. Here's a key. So again, in 1 year's time, this is what it had progressed to, and this was certainly, what we're sending out is certainly recognizable compared to this.
So question, so you're saying it started with a 3-month trial funding from Cincinnati, and I guess they weren't overwhelmed by it because they didn't continue to fund it, but he kept it going a little bit, and then Western Union took it up as a commercial venture?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
As near as I can tell, Western Union was in the business, obviously, of selling telegraphy services, but they also would report on weather conditions. So they knew that they had something that they could sell. What Abby provided that was enhanced was this sense of probabilities. So Abby basically kept this together after it had run out in December of 1869. The funding had from Cincinnati had run out. He kept it going, and he did train enough people at Western Union, because he had a close collaboration with them, to take over the probabilities. Now, they were not trained meteorologists, they were not mathematicians, so it probably wasn't a good handoff, but a handoff nonetheless. But yes, to answer your first point, yes, it's not as though Cincinnati didn't see a commercial need for it. They just said, hey, you're not going to get funding from us. This is a group of merchants. We'll put together some funding, but this will just be a trial. Go to Western Union for long-term resources. I think that's probably the way it went.
Brian, do we know if were these symbols Abby's creation, or had someone else come up with the idea before him and he was just using their idea?
I don't know the exact answer to that. Probably Abby put these together from maybe some European symbols that were going on. I don't know the answer to that. But when he got to the Signal Service and he started to really introduce many more gradients and many more measurements, these symbols had to evolve. So the evolution was Abby. What we know of as a cold front moving in, or a warm front moving in, or a front being moved, he developed that, but that was later, after Cincinnati.
I have a question about data collection. The National Weather Bureau Service has these standard weather collection boxes that have been around for a long time. That they all have the same kind of instruments in them, and they're all kind of primitive, but they're accurate. And because these things have been around for so long, the data over a long period of time is comparable. And these started in the 19th century sometime. Do you know anything about whether he was using them then?
Yeah. In fact, one of the cool things about what we have at the observatory is we have not only some of his early data gatherings, but then also his arrangement and his correspondence of using various instruments and the development of the instruments. Now, the world leaders in terms of instrumentation and precise measurements came out of Germany. So he was corresponding a lot with the German instrument makers and whatnot. But there are things called sling psychrometers, which and wet bulb measurements that actually would measure humidity, would measure temperature gradients, would measure the barometric pressure, all of that. He kind of selected the instruments based on that. But to your point, yeah, many of the instruments that were developed in the 19th century are analogs to what's being used today. Abby was right in the middle of all that. So there's a lot of correspondence, some in German, that has to do with setting up these instruments. It's fascinating stuff. And as I will kind of get into very shortly, we have a great finding guide that will allow us to actually delve into some of these archives. We have a vast treasure trove. I don't know if that answers your question.
I want to clarify something. So Abby left for Western Union. Was he hired to continue this work there?
No, that's a good point of clarification. Abby did not go to work for Western Union. He stayed employed up until 1870. You'll see kind of in the next slide. He stayed. In fact, let's move forward to that. He stayed with the observatory. It wasn't until 1870, late 1870, October 8th, that he tendered his resignation. At that point, he went back to New York with really no, again, the ancestral home, if you will. His parents were still there. He was a relatively young man. He was 32 years old, but he went home with no real prospects of employment. So in that brief time period from December of 1869 to October of 1870, he was still employed by the observatory, but he was working closely with Western Union, and he knew those people extremely well, and working closely with the Cincinnati office manager, and supplying them information, and then also passing on some of his forecasting skills, if you will. But it was for no compensation, anything like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So kind of bringing all this together, just summarizing all this, again, it continued to fester that he just had this year-to-year funding. He was frustrated with the fact that there was no more funding for his grand experiment. He knew this was a big deal, but he was stuck up in Mount Adams, where he had poor observing conditions, the building limitations, the building was leaking, just all of that. Finally culminated, he sent in a letter of resignation and he moved to New York. Well, that letter of resignation was never accepted by the city council or the union. It just was. They viewed it as a leave of absence. It's almost as if, well, he'll be back.
Did the salary continue?
What was that?
Did the salary continue?
No. As far as I know, it did not. I don't know the actual the actual answer to that, but they just looked at it as a leave of absence, without pay.
Okay.
There was no replacement because they said, okay, well, he'll be back, or they just didn't accept it. He did continue correspondence during the leave of absence. And in fact, there's a letter that exists in the UC archives that says, hey, we could come up with selling astronomical time for $1,000 a year to the city of Cincinnati. And basically, he came up with plans for that. He also started a two-way conversation on kind of consulting, if you will, on the moving of the observatory from Mount Adams to Mount Lookout. But it was just a dicey time for that. But and we'll kind of get into that in just a second. But basically, by 1871, January, February of 1871, he moved to the Signal Corps, Washington, D.C., all of that, and he just left Cincinnati behind. So that was that. Basically, here's a summary of our collection. We've got a bust, which I'll show you in just a second, donated by his son. We have innumerable manuscripts, correspondence, papers, notes, just a whole lot of stuff that's been a whole lot of fun going through. We do have a finding guide for it. It was compiled in 2016 by a representative of the Ohio History Corps, and there was a Xavier intern, which allows you to go into all the various files, and it's very well done. That was before my time. Craig, do you have any comments on how that all came together? Again, that was before my time. Craig Nemi?
Craig had to run to the observatory. There's a little emergency there, so he's not here at the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, just moving on. We do have the original 1868 and 1869 reports by Abbey to the Astronomical Society. They're fascinating because here's a guy that's working under pretty bad conditions and whatnot, and he gives kind of a blow by blow. It's a yearly report of the progress that he's making for the 2 years that he was here. We do have a railroad map, which I'll show you in just a second, with proposed time meridians. And then we've got a lot of information on his invitation to Lord Kelvin's 1898 Jubilee. Of course, Kelvin of the Kelvin scale and a lot of the temperature measurements that are going on. That's fascinating as well. Here's the bust of Hergert, of Abbey. Here are a couple of documents that I found that are just fascinating. What we have are a lot of handwritten notes, not notes, handwritten letters. This one's from 1881, September 12th, 1881. What we have are the drafts. It gives you an insight as to how Abbey like with all drafts, in the later stages of his communication. We don't have the originals. The originals went out to the recipients, which basically have found their way to the Library of Congress. So in fact, you'll find the finished letters that have gone out. But here's a letter that I thought was interesting. It came from the War Department, the Office of Chief Signal Officer, September 12th, 1881, to Thomas Edison. And he basically in this saying, hey, thank you so much for the loan of your new light bulb. It has been a grand success. And he goes on to say, boy, it would be great if you could develop a small lamp because, whoops, I can use it in my study room where we have these men getting together 3 times daily for 3 hours each, and we need a small version of this map, of this light bulb. Well, 1881, that's a year after he made, Edison made it commercially available, and only a year before, 1879, when he had developed the first long-lasting light bulb. So anyway, I just thought here was a point of history where he's talking to some of the top inventors and scientists of the day. Here's another one that I find fascinating. September 26, 1903, to Mr. Wilbur Wright in Dayton, Ohio. Basically up here, he's talking about, hey, I know you've been doing a lot of work at Kitty Hawk, and you've got a lot of data on wind currents. Hey, I think this would be of interest in my weather journal. And so if you can send it out to me, I'll see that it will get published. So that's what this part has to deal with. Notice also that it's typewritten, whereas before it was handwritten. By 1903, they were typewritten. So you can see how he is making the last changes on his draft. But this I thought was great.
So when he left Cincinnati, he did not leave weather. When he went to DC, was he for weather?
Yes.
Okay.
He was, because DC had realized that his probabilities were absolutely the way to go. And they needed to be able to forecast weather, because what they were dealing with, and the Signal Corps, again, was in charge of overseeing or regulating westward expansion. For the first time, huge settler populations were getting into this part of the Midwest, which, as we all know, is Tornado Alley, right? They needed to know about these storms. They needed to know about the storms on the Great Lakes. I mean, the Great Lakes, I don't know if you've ever been on Lake Erie. When a storm front comes in, it's like the hand of God coming down, and it's a very shallow lake, and you can be in 12-foot waves in a matter of minutes when a wind's coming up. So you had a need for forecasts. So the Signal Corps said, yeah, Abby, you're the guy. Come on out here, we can give you a job.
So the purpose of forecasts early on was to give you time for preparation. Is that the thing?
Yes, and also because if you could forecast rainfall, and we're talking about big, monstrous rainfalls like we've just had in Cincinnati here, 2-3 inch rainfalls, the river levels can get up to unnavigable proportions very, very quickly with a rainstorm. If you can see it coming, you can harbor your barges, you can protect your shipping, that type of thing. The opposite takes place if there's a drought for a prolonged period and the river goes down to unnavigable levels. It's going to play havoc. So yes, there was a need for weather forecasts.
And so weathers could predict droughts. I thought they occur over long periods.
Well, they do, but if you see a large, I don't know, to use today's words, large high pressure zone building for a long period of time, and you see weather systems forecasting, you can basically say, hey, the river's not going to go up at least in the next week or so. That kind of thing.
I got it. Thank you.
Well, just to finish up with this note, so September 26, 1903, this paragraph has to deal with, and I'll just read it real quick. As regards to the problem of flight, is it really necessary to attack the most difficult question at the present moment? Would it not be practicable to devise a flapping machine attached by a trolley to an electric wire overhead so that a man could simply be raised a few feet above the ground and carried along by the flapping, the work being done by the electrical current? Question mark. Well, I'm just thinking Wilbur Wright, he had to be at this point crating up all of his information, getting ready to go out to Kitty Hawk. The first flight was on December 17th. And here's this guy, esteemed scientist, way out over his skis saying, wait a minute. Yeah, flapping machine, right? So I just thought it was very interesting. Abby also was a good friend of Samuel Langley in the Smithsonian, and he was a big advocate of this flapping machine, which failed horribly in 1903. Anyway, I just thought this was a moment in history where Wilbur Wright must have just said, yeah, fine, yeah, I'll send the data, but this guy's crazy, right? Or at least we've got a better solution. Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting moment of time.
Everyone has a few letters they wish that no one else would read.
That's right. And here I am publicizing it, right? So this is fascinating. This is the April 1883 Railway Commission map showing proposed standard time zones based on, again, these 15-degree meridians, which is the length of time that the Earth travels 1 hour across, the sun. So this is 1883. Notice here's a line, Eastern time zone. And right here, it's kind of hard to see, Central time zone, Mountain time zone, Pacific time zone. Now, these time zones have moved and been gerrymandered, over the years and whatnot. But here you see for the first time in April of 1883, this was the map that was used by the Railroad Commission in November of 1883. Again, this is dated April of 1883. November of 1883, this is what they adopted. What is also fascinating about this is you see the states of, these are all railroads, and you see how much they were, by 1883. Here it is in the Midwest. Here's Cincinnati. You can see the locus that Cincinnati was in terms of the commercial aspect of that. You can see the westward expansion, and you could also see the westward expansion. The first transcontinental railroad going through Promontory was 1869. So 14 years later, this was the state of expansion. And this map, Craig allowed me to go and get it scanned in. We've now got 107, we've got a professional scan. This thing blows up to amazing proportions, and you can see the detail of the expansion. But to me, it's just a fascinating map.
It's sure changed a lot.
What was that?
The lines have changed a lot.
Oh yeah, they sure have. They sure have. But again, I was just struck by how much progress they had made in just 14 years. In fact, my family, my mother, and comes from this area. The railroad was coming out, and the railroad got into her area 1876, which is right here in Oklahoma. So it just, not 1876, 1885. So in 2 years, it went from here to here in Oklahoma. And you can actually see the rivers that were here, and they're all labeled. This is incredible that it can be blown up to the degree it had.
Is that Eastern time zone boundary current, or has it changed?
It has changed quite a lot, mostly by politics. In the 1920s, there was a attempt. I did it again. Attempt at a standardization of that, but it has moved quite a lot, and it moves every 4 or 5 years. It's really been chopped up in the West, and I think the Central time zone has moved over quite a lot. At the time, the meridian placed it right here. Well, right here is like St. Louis. I think that right there is St. Louis. Well, as we know, the Central Time Zone moved out to Western Indiana. So it moved quite a lot from the original 15-degree meridian lines. But it's just a fascinating historical document. And this was found all folded up in the bottom of a cabinet.
Was this only for that area or did it extend to the world?
Well, the chronology was it extended to the world by 1885. So this was the proposal in April of 83. In November of 83, it was accepted. Europe took notice, realized Abby was the major contributor to this, and then they sent Abby over to the World Conference, and basically they adopted it by setting the prime meridian in Greenwich and the international date line, by the Philippines, just 2 years later.
Okay.
So again, you think how slowly things seem to move in today's world. In 2 years, this was adopted worldwide. Fascinating. And this goes back to the earlier question. This is a private house now, but it is out on it's not the west side. It's right off of 75 in the right off the Paddock exit. This is the former Abbey Meteorological Observatory. I took a picture of it, and there's a plaque here that identifies it as the Meteorological Observatory, and it also, there's a memorial here as well. This is the only existing structure. It existed, it was in operation from 1917, which was a year after Abbey's death, to 1983, and it was called the Abbey Meteorological Observatory. The one
Where did you say that was?
It's in, I don't know. Well,
Hey, Brian,
Yeah.
I think I'm right about, I'm not positive. I think it's actually on Lafayette Circle in Clifton.
Right.
No, this isn't in Clifton. This is
No?
On Lafayette Circle. That's where it was, but it doesn't actually exist. This exists. I drove out to it. It exists right east of 75. You know where the I don't know the actual name of the town, but you know where Ivorydale is, off 75. It's just to the east of there.
That's
Clifton.
Is it Clifton? Okay.
Yeah, I know where it is. It's up at right at the brow of the hill, overlooking Winton, overlooking the Mitchell exit.
Yes.
Yes, you can, it's, in fact, if you go down Lafayette Circle in, I guess, far off, right off Clifton Avenue, drive down Lafayette runs north and south across Clifton. If you take the northern branch, at the very end is this circle, and that building is right at the end of the circle. I've been in that building. I was a geography major at UC in the late 60s, and they had some if my memory is kind of hazy, but they had some very old, what seemed to me to be very old meteorological equipment there. I don't know where it is now. It's a private residence now, but
Yeah. I didn't go up and knock on the door because it was a private residence, but again, you can see the plaque there that commemorates it. So, just in summary, I mean, that's basically what I have. This was a fascinating man. And he sought an understanding of the natural world through observation, data collection. Networking, that's the one thing that I really want to impress on you. I'm so impressed with that. He applied the theories. So he wasn't just a scientist that ruminated and theorized. He applied it. He connected the dots. He set the course for the reinvigoration. It would have died without him. The Cincinnati Observatory, and he sponsored and promoted the study of meteorology as a practical science. And I close with his vision for the future. And it's not enough to know what the conditions have been and are. We have to know what they will be and why so. And he basically, I'll let you read it, but he basically says, look, this is all about physics, and it's up to the physics and mathematician to work on it. He would very much be amazed, but also he would encourage us to continue what we're doing. I mean, the fastest supercomputers in the world that can manage trillions of calculations per second are not able to keep up real time with atmospheric conditions. They're so much better than they were, and he would applaud us for that. But he would say, "Hey, he's right. This is all about mathematics." And hopefully, as computers develop even more so, we'll be able to get closer to a real-time prediction. But it's a fascinating man. If you want to know more, there's a great book that came out as I was preparing this presentation about a year ago by Sean Potter, who's a meteorologist, and he's part of the National Weather Service. He wrote a book. It's called Too Near for Dreams. And it really gives a lot of color to what I've just kind of summarized here. But I encourage you. It's available on Amazon. It's available anywhere. It's a great read, and he's certainly someone to be admired. So that's all I have. Certainly open it up for discussion. I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
I have three quick. I'll really try to make this quick because we're coming up on noon. First of all, I bought that book. It's excellent. It's excellent. It's very much a biography about his personal life too, which is very interesting. And it just shows the struggles that a person of science went through at that point and how he overcame them. I'm not finished with it yet, but it's a really good read too. It really is. Yep. Another really good book, if you're interested in surveying, which is tied in with this, right? Like knowing where you are on the earth. And to do that, they had to know time and so forth. There's a book called Measuring America. That's really fascinating, all about surveying and land and so forth. It's somewhat related to this. The other thing, I had an administrative assistant that lived in, talking about time, that lived in her family was all from like far southwestern Indiana. So Harrison, Ohio, as some of you probably know, one side of the street is in Ohio and the other side of the street is in Indiana. And Indiana for a long time did not observe daylight savings, which created all kinds of havoc over there. So they had a way of communicating this. When they would talk about an appointment, they would say fast time or slow time. I always got a kick out of that. And then last thing, we focus on our weather here, but the history of meteorology, a lot of it had to do, weather and shipping was it was life and death. It was life and death. Coastal shipping, when you go back to New England and the whaling industry and the fishing industry, knowing where you are was pretty darn critical, and being able to at least have some kind of a forecast just from looking at the clouds could be really helpful. So this was very practical, important stuff. The Scandinavians were, I think they're credited with, who decides this stuff? The fathers of or the mothers of a particular science, but the Scandinavians were very early on really important with weather, along with the Germans. So that's it.
Great.
I have to wonder how he would react to climate change discussions today. I don't expect an answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that a number of times.
Well, I've got kind of a time-related question. So when I was a young teenager, I recall we had a wall clock, which I believe had a synchronous motor, which meant it was the rate at which it moved, depending on the AC 60 cycle type thing. When did power stations start transmitting power that way?
But they don't work. Europe has different frequencies, so you can't take your clock like that from one place to another.
Yeah, well, this would have been in the U.S.
Yeah.
One of the most important economic drivers for extremely accurate time synchronization was that the power net is nationwide. So somebody's generating 60 cycle power in New York, it'd damn well be exactly 60 cycles on the network from which machines in Colorado are contributing, and it damn well better be in phase. So, I mean, I think that's probably by now, they probably use atomic clocks, the National Bureau of Standards atomic clocks to synchronize everybody. But I think, your clock that works off 60 cycles is probably still not still accurate. I don't know any reason why it wouldn't be.
Well, I'm curious as to when the power companies started doing that.
Oh, can't tell you. Sorry.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, Westinghouse and Tesla powered the 1893 Columbian Exposition. And I think probably back in that era is when they came up with the cycles on AC.
Yeah, I do know that was alternating current, whereas Edison was all about direct current.
Correct.
And alternating current is when you've got the cycles and whatnot. So it wouldn't have worked with direct.
No, direct is direct. I mean, there's no cycles.
Right.
So we were talking about books. The book about Harrison is a book by Davis Sobel called Longitude. And it's all about the Longitude Prize that was offered by the King of England. It's a very good book.
Analogous to the X Prize.
Right. And why the prize was offered was that an arrogant admiral told his navigator that the admiral knew where they were, and the admiral ran his fleet into the Scilly Islands and wrecked it, and the admiral was killed. And that's what prompted the Longitude Prize, because the admiral didn't know what he was doing.
It was a little bit more like the Space Prize, in the sense that it was one of the first modern grant agencies. What surprised me reading that book was that the product of the calculation was meant to be international. The British were doing it, but they realized that worldwide communication and trade was very much in their interests, and safeguarding it was essential to their empire. So they didn't mind if other nations got the benefit of it. Chronometers were only one leg of what they were trying. There was an astronomical method. And I love the way it fits into measuring America, because I remember reading at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, no one knew how big the continent was to any real accuracy, because they hadn't been able to measure the longitude at more than places than the eastern seaboard, one port which a British ship measured, and I think, oddly enough, because of Missouri, because of the Clark expedition had managed to measure the longitude via an astronomical method in one location near St. Louis. So nobody knew how big the continent was. You can imagine astronomers, being excited and tasked to try and come up with that kind of information.
Well, I think Cincinnati, due to the efforts of the observatory, was one of the first inland cities to have its longitude accurately and precisely measured.
Right.
Can I share my screen?
I'll stop mine.
How do I?
Okay, Brian, if you need to get going, I know you've got something to go to, feel
Yeah.
free to.
I'd very much like to do that. Yeah, I
Okay.
do want to be part of this.
The National Weather Service.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks all. Been a lot of fun. Give me a
Thanks,
call
Brian.
if you'd like anything more.
Thank you
much.
very much. Very much appreciated.
Righto.